Thank you, Professor Frame, for the invitation to be here. It's our pleasure and privilege to be with you all to talk about, as Professor Frame highlighted, what is the emerging third force in Australian politics. Before we get there, of course, it's important to note that in previous Howard government retrospectives, there was discussion about how the Howard government's time in office had actually coincided with the rise of a number of new political parties. And in the first period, of course, there was the Australian Greens, and from 1998 onwards, there was Pauline Hanson's One Nation as well. It's also important to note that this period in office also coincided with the time where one of the more established parties in the Australian system, the Australian Democrats, started to decline. So our focus for today's discussion is to look at green politics as a broad idea. We will explore, in particular, the issue as to whether the Howard government was actually responsible for the rise of the Australian Greens in national politics, especially during this last period in office between 2004 and 2007. I will begin by examining the Australian Greens, and I will highlight how the party evolved in this last term of government for the Howard Coalition. And my colleague later will then examine how these broader issues relating to green politics were dealt with by the Howard government. Before we begin, though, it's important to remember that green parties have been a feature of Australian politics well before the Howard government's time started in 1996. Of course, the Nuclear Disarmament Party emerged and won Senate representation in the early 1980s, and the West Australian Greens, of course, were represented in the Senate in the early 1990s. But it was not until 1996, of course, that the nascent Australian Greens Party, led by Dr. Bob Brown, first won Senate representation. The significance of this was that the party was mobilised by the coming together of two broad social movement strands. The first being the peace and disarmament movement, and the second being, of course, the conservation movement. While Bob Brown campaigned on environmental conservation in the party's early years, issues, of course, concerning peace and disarmament started to become far more prominent in the national political debate. This was especially true in the aftermath of the 2001 terrorist attacks in the United States and the subsequent response to terrorism and foreign policies by both the coalition government and the Labor Party. This allowed Brown, as leader of the Greens, to reposition the party as being qualitatively different to other political forces. For example, where the Australian Democrats had sought to use their position in the Senate to, as Don Chipp had famously said, to keep the bastards honest, to keep the major parties accountable, the Greens used their role in the chamber to vigorously advance a very specific policy agenda with clear links to the peace and disarmament movement. In particular, a case of this was very evident when Bob Brown and fellow Greens Senator Kerry Nettle were ejected from the Australian Parliament for interrupting the speech by the United States President George W. Bush in late 2003. This not only generated significant media coverage, both national and international, for the Greens, but for many voters, it consolidated the idea that the Greens were a unique political force in Australia. It appeared that those voters who had rejected the major parties' policies on foreign policy and on terrorism had suddenly discovered a new political party to support. The Greens in this time also underwent significant organisational reforms, which appeared to strengthen the party in the lead-up to the 2004 election. The West Australian Greens, which had, of course, been the continuation of the Nuclear Disarmament Party in that state, had emerged and was starting to flail. In the year 2003, just before the 2004 campaign started, the WA Greens finally became part of the Australian Greens confederated structure and, of course, linked in with the idea that green issues, environmental issues, were to be central to the 2004 campaign, especially as we heard yesterday, with the rise of the forest policy in Tasmania and logging becoming a high-profile campaign issue at the time. Within this context, it appeared that the policy choices of the Howard government contributed to making the Greens an emerging national political force. Furthermore, expectations, especially within the Greens and some supporters, were high that the party's more adversarial approach, as well as its more resolved organisational structure, would actually lead to stronger electoral results in 2004. This, of course, did play out to a degree. The party's national primary vote in the Senate rose from 4.9% in 2001 to 7.8% in 2004, a significant improvement. The party also won two additional seats in the chamber, which meant that it would hold 4 seats when the new Senate was to start its term. The idea that the Australian Greens was becoming a major political force in Australia was now enhanced by the fact that the Australian Democrats had actually failed to win representation in 2004. This was the first time since 1977 that the Australian Democrats had failed to win a Senate seat. This result suggested that the Greens had now displaced the Democrats as the so-called third force in the Senate and was on an upward trajectory. The problem for the Greens, however, was that the government, of course, enjoyed a swing on a two-party preferred basis of almost 2%. A strong performance also in Queensland allowed the Howard government to win 4 from 6 Senate seats in that state and consequently hold a majority in the Senate. As Scott Prass's presentation yesterday reminded us, this was a rare feat in post-war Australian politics. As a result, the 2004 to 2007 period was one in which the power and influence of the Greens in the Senate was marginalised. The party did not hold the balance of power, and consequently its capacity to shape and influence national policy was diminished. This did not mean, however, that the Green agenda was to disappear from Australian politics. As my colleague Dr. Nick Economou will now explain, policies concerning natural resources and the environment were indeed prominent during the last term of the Howard government.
Thank you, Zareh. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this project, and I'm also grateful to Tom for allowing an interloper to suddenly appear at short notice. Zareh, I think, has done a terrific job of outlining where we think the Greens are at, and I thought my job might be to talk a little bit about the policy consequences of the Howard government between 2004-2007 and how they resonated with how we perceived what the Green debate might be and what causal effects these might have had on this perception that the Greens are on the rise. To get to the conclusion at the beginning, I'm a bit sceptical about this claim about the rise of the Greens. I think the Greens' best election was certainly not 2004, not 2007, it was 2010, when Labor was in government. And Labor had tried to pick up many of the agenda items that the Howard government had started. So I think there's a degree of scepticism associated with the claim that the Greens were on an upward electoral trajectory to the extent that the Greens themselves like to claim. Green perspectives, though, did resonate on policy debates in other areas. So that's what I want to try and tease out if I can. Just to reiterate the key points from Zareh, just to help my own thinking, just to remind you about what happened in 2004. That 2004 federal election, which of course, that's the one that the Howard government defeats Mark Latham. The House of Representatives result was quite odd. I remember this quite well because I was involved in another project at the time, looking at each federal election. I was asked to look at it from a Victorian perspective. There was evidence there that there'd been swings to Labor in Victoria, but mainly in places that wouldn't help Labor. Many Liberal and National MPs who were holding marginal seats were able to defend them. The really interesting result, I thought, was actually in the Senate. If you wanted to get an idea of how the Australian electorate was responding to politics, the Senate was giving a better indication than the House of Reps. And if I can just remind you about the key results in the 2004 Half Senate contest. Everybody's referred to them over and over again. I think they're worth reminding ourselves about them. The first one is that the Greens didn't actually do that well. There'd been a slight increase in their primary vote, but not particularly dramatic. The Tasmanians had been re-elected, but no great advances there. There had been a very interesting controversy about the result in Victoria, where the Greens had got a pretty substantial primary vote, 6% as I recall, but didn't win the seat because Labor had directed its preferences under the old group vote ticket system to Family First. And Steve Fielding from Family First won the seat. And it's a little known fact that the Tasmanian branch of the Labor Party did the same thing with Jackie Petrusma from Family First, and she very nearly beat Christine Milne into that final position. The difference was the Tasmanians, of course, as we know, have a rich history of filling in all their own squares under the black line. Only 80% of Labor partisans voted the Labor ticket. The other 20% filled in their own preferences, directed them to Christine Milne, and she got over the line. So it could have been an even bigger disaster for the Greens. But the result I think that the most significant was in Queensland, where Pauline Hanson ran as an independent, picked up 4% of the vote. About half of those people voting for her followed the the Pauline Hanson ticket. She wasn't in One Nation at this stage. And the other half filled in their own ballots, and that was to the benefit of the third-placed Liberal candidate Russell Trude, as I recall, and Barnaby Joyce, because, of course, the Nationals were running a separate ticket in Queensland at that time. So the Liberals and the Nationals picked up a total of 4 out of 6 Queensland seats, and that was the coalition's majority. So in fact, the Greens weren't important in the Senate between 2005, of course, constitutionally, when the new Senate kicks in 2007, was actually Barnaby Joyce. Do you remember him? I've been here for a couple of days and haven't made much mention of him. So that's important. And we move on now to what the Howard government did in the context of environmental policy. What Zareh and I were trying to draw people's attention to is that we think, when we talk about green politics in general, there are 2 broad themes to Australian green politics. This is well accepted by scholars who've looked at it. I think particularly of an article by Peter Hay and Marcus Howard back in the 1980s, 1990s, when the Tasmanian conservationists were on the march, and they identified 2 contributing political movements, if you will. The conservation movement and the peace, disarmament, anti-nuclear movement. And of course, we think the Australian Greens make up those 2 components. And it's important to know that because when the question was asked of us, Tom asked us, can you assess the Howard government's contribution to the rise of the Greens? The response is 2-dimensional. In the area of peace, disarmament, anti-nuclear politics, if you will, perhaps the Howard government did make a major contribution. The pursuit of a couple of policy objectives and the resolute defence of the idea that under no circumstances would the Howard government ratify the Kyoto Protocol for whatever reason, whether it was because it was against the economic interests of Australian industry, although I suspect, and I think Alexander Downer confirmed it just now, that was really also about Australian foreign policy, making sure that we indicated that we were firmly aligned with the United States. We didn't want to embarrass the United States and the US position on climate change and so forth. And that may have contributed to this sense, well, because I take Roger Beale's point earlier today that there was something quite symbolic, totemic about this refusal to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The Howard government's critics, the social progressive critics, not just on the other side of the parliament, but in the press, in the universities, in the cafes and salons of the inner cities of Melbourne and Sydney, this became a sort of totemic, symbolic thing, which meant then that if you asked them, as they were getting off their bikes and having a chai latte, did the Howard government have an environmental policy, a climate change? No, they did not. No, it did not. It was anti the environment, etc. Well, we don't think that that's right. In the chapter that we're drafting for Tom, we try to outline a series of policy initiatives. Again, the presentation this morning, if I may use a meteorological metaphor, my thunder was stolen somewhat because I wanted also to go through what I thought as an observer, not a participant, but an an observer of the politics of this stuff, that between 2004 and 2007, some really important initiatives were undertaken. They were mainly to do with water conservation policy. I feel that they were driven by political considerations. The drought that refused to break was of particularly had particular consequences for the Murray-Darling Basin, which we must remember is a coalition constituency. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin is an important area, not just economically, an important producer of food. The communities that are dependent on, pardon me, just one moment, that are dependent on irrigation, also very strong supporters of the coalition, Liberal Party, National Party. So there's a political imperative for the government to do something, the government's initiatives included, amongst other things, an attempt to use COAG to try and coordinate the states so that infrastructure could be improved to try and stop things like leaks and loss of water through evaporation. There was the $10 billion package for the Murray-Darling Basin, and I think this was significant too. There was an attempt to reorganise the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. It was renamed the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. New legislation was brought into place to try and improve the processes by which there would be water allocations. And of course there was the climate change issue. The Howard government was not against trying to find ways to mitigate carbon gases. In fact, as the 2007 federal election hoved into view, it actually had promised the Australian electorate that if it was returned, it would bring an emissions trading scheme. It's interesting because despite the difference in rhetoric between Labor and the coalition on these things, there's also a great deal of consensus. Labor was also going to have an emissions trading scheme. That was the whole thing that Kevin Rudd promised when he became Prime Minister. Labor also used the administrative infrastructure that had been put in place by the Howard government to try and manage the Murray-Darling Basin. I also think it was interesting to track, I like doing these sorts of things, I think these people are important. Ministers are important to policy making, and it was interesting to track the ministers who were responsible for the environment between 2004 and 2007, because I'd forgotten one of these interesting environmental issues that came up. Senator Ian Campbell from Western Australia was the minister in the first instance, as I recall, between 2004 and 2007, and of course he was immediately associated with a controversy about an orange-bellied parrot, you may recall. There was, and this I think was part and parcel of a deeper conflict that was going on between the then state Labor government of Victoria and the federal government, and also to do about marginal seat strategy. And Senator Campbell had indicated that he was not going to give federal government approval until there'd been more work done on the orange-bellied parrot. But the person, of course, who was most interesting to observe during this time was a chap by the name of Malcolm Turnbull. He had been a backbencher at the beginning of this period. He was then appointed to a task force on water policy, and he would eventually become the Environment Minister and would be responsible for trying to navigate the move towards an emissions trading scheme. All of this, of course, was terminated by the 2007 federal election. So, what does this all tell us? What conclusions can we draw? And can we answer the question that Tom set for us? Was the Howard government responsible for the rise of the Greens? The response, I think, is a bit complicated. When it came to matters of environmental policy, I don't think that the Howard government really was responsible for the rise of the Greens, mainly because so much was being done in the area of environmental policy and that ought to have obtained the approval of the Greens. Not that it really mattered, because they didn't have a presence in the Senate. Not a presence worth anything. I mean, if you're a minor party and you hold the balance of power in the upper house, well, you're in a position to exercise some influence over policy making through the processes of negotiation, dialogue, threats of not passing something if you don't like it. The Australian Democrats, as I recall, have done that over industrial relations policies for a number of years. But I think all of that was not really relevant, because the Green political movement was not really interested in that as such. They'd moved on to something else. They'd moved on and were motivated by the idea of the environmental debate being an existentialist debate, not a practical policy debate. To me, this is the important difference between, say, a conservative approach to environmental policy and the social democratic approach. The conservative approach sees the environment as a practical problem requiring practical solutions, and you address these things if there's a political reason for doing it. And I suggest that what was happening to the Murray-Darling Basin was part of it. That the real issue and the real area in which the Howard government might have had a major contribution to the rise of the Greens was in this notion of green politics as a manifestation of international politics, international relations. That the Greens had seized upon the idea that the Kyoto Treaty was crucially important, that any refusal to participate in that, to ratify it, was symbolic of obstinate refusal to agree to the ecological notion that there's a huge crisis going on that requires not just practical policy responses that seek to balance competing interests without losing an election, but that instead you should respond to this thing because you have to. If you don't, the world as we know it will end by 2096 or whatever year it is that they worry about, you shouldn't worry about the electoral consequences. The disappointing political party, I think, in all of this is the Labor Party, which aligns itself with that rationality, and Labor's failure to live up to the expectations of the small component of the political community that expected a fulsome embracing of that existentialist view of the ecological crisis. Labor's failure to do that effectively meant that there was disenchantment. And as is often the case, when disenchantment occurs, electoral realignments occur as well. I think Labor's more culpable for the rise of the Greens than the Howard government. There's no doubt that the Greens were starting to emerge. Zareh makes the point, the Australian Democrats are falling by the wayside, and there's always going to be a need for some sort of broker party in the Senate contest. But in my view, the 2007 federal election, and I'll finish on this point, the result of the 2007 federal election, a government-changing election, a swing to Labor. All right, sure, some Green candidates in some marginal seats directing preferences may have had an influence on the result, but the swing to Labor was comprehensive enough for Labor to be able to secure a pretty clear majority, not like the situation in 2013. But the Senate response is also interesting too, because the Greens only really picked up an additional seat that was in South Australia. They didn't pick up any seats in the Murray-Darling Basin, and there were no dodgy preference deals that had characterised 2004. The swing to support to the Greens was not that great. So, in conclusion, it's not a clear-cut answer. I think Australian politics is a complicated beast, and all sorts of complex factors contribute to it. But I do think that there's a tendency for the Greens, for some of the Greens advocates and supporters in the political commentary community, so that's the press, the universities, tend to overstate the impact of the Greens, especially during this period, and I think it was mainly to do with the anger that the social democratic side of politics seemed to have over the Kyoto issue rather than anything else. Thank you. What do we do now?
So let me ask, where did the Democrat vote go?
John Zareh, you're the Democrat expert.
Well, once the Democrats disappeared, I mean, really their vote started to go back. There was always the argument that the Democrats never really had a core constituency. And I suppose it did go back to the coalition, it probably went back to the Labor Party, it probably seeped into the Greens. I think the problem that the Democrats always had, because they were so brittle, they were so fragile in terms of electoral support, they could never count on regular support from constituencies. So their support just went back into the pool. Part of it, I think, Tom, if I can give a slightly longer-winded answer, there was a period of transition where the Democrats sought to recast themselves as an environmental party in this period as well. And the leadership of Natasha Stott-Despoy in particular was one where the party sought to reposition it as a more adversarial, advocacy-based party where the environment was a central issue. They tried to get in on this area, but they just couldn't. They were outflanked, their organisation failed, but I suspect some of the Democrats voters who were attracted to the green credentials of the party then started supporting
Could we get that,
the
Tom?
Greens.
Could we get that? The 2004 half-Senate election, which was the first of the first of them where the Democrats failed to win a seat. I think that's right, isn't it, Zareh? But more importantly, that's important, but actually what's more important is the idea that one of the major parties, or the two mainstream parties, Liberal National, the coalition, wins a majority in the Senate. Let's remember, why did the Australian Democrats appear? What was the reason for them? What caused them? Well, the 1975 constitutional crisis. They were an expression of a certain component of the Australian community, whether they were Labor voting or Liberal voting, who didn't like what happened in 75. And the whole point of, well, we're going to keep the bastards honest, in my view, was based on this idea, we will act as a brokerage party between the two major parties. And most importantly of all, implicit in that role is this idea, don't let the major parties control the Senate, we will do it. Now, once a major party wins control of the Senate, as the coalition did in 2004, the whole rationale for the Australian Democrats suddenly disappears. There must be a whole new generation of Australian voters who've come on for whom that message no longer resonates. But that new lot of voters coming on find ideological political parties a lot more appealing, a lot more attractive. You know, the vote for the Democrats starts to fall. Pauline Hanson, One Nation have been up and down. Family First is appearing on the horizon. The Greens are starting to do well. These are parties that are quite ideological. They're polarising the debate. They stand for things. They're prepared to do deals with the major parties on preferences the Australian Democrats never were. So something has happened in the Australian body politic which sees the decline of centrism and the rise of these ideological fringe parties, of which the Greens are a subset. The only brief reappearance of centrism occurred when Nick Xenophon put together the Nick Xenophon team, and it did well in whatever that was, 2016. But that's dissipated again. So if we look at Senate voting behaviour, it's fascinating to look at. There's a de-alignment occurring for the major parties. It's much worse for Labor than it is for the coalition. Labor's primary vote for the Senate is really low, dangerously low. You know, there have been Senate elections where they can only get one Senate position in a state in a half-Senate election. That's where the real Labor crisis is, and these much more ideological parties are picking it up. So I think the decline of the Australian Democrats, the answer to that question is that constituency is just dissipated, and in its place, there's a vacuum that's appeared, and in its place, there are voters now who look at the Senate contest, they look at the parties that are contesting and saying, this is where I'm going to make my ideological mark. I'm going to align myself with these ideological parties. You know, I don't want to do it for the lower house because that's the contest for executive government, but I can do it in the Senate. And the Senate now, I think, is starting to evolve away from being the party of negotiation, dialogue, doing deals, as the Democrats used to do, into a place now where people stand up and they yell at each other, they yell abuse at each other, they come in wearing burqas, you know, they misbehave in the Senate, all in the name of polarised politics.
But is it though, say if we take the 1987 election, where you start to see what does differentiate the two major parties? That's the election I think in the 80s, where it's difficult to kind of pick them apart because Hawke and Keating were doing the kind of things that John Howard wanted to do. So, and then there was a movement towards the centre, and what we found a decade later is that the Democrats in the centre fail. The Pauline Hanson and the Greens sort of arise at the same time to actually pull out the political landscape a little further. So one balances the other. If the two major parties are heading towards the centre, then you've got one on the left and one on the right, and they're going to pull votes in those general directions. Is that another way of seeing it, or you wouldn't buy that?
No, I think so, Tom. And I think the other thing that we probably should remember is that following the Howard government period, there's an explosion in the number of political parties that appear on the scene that have actually been mobilised by the success of the Greens, to an extent of the Democrats, and of course One Nation as well. So we start to see the increase in the number of, from few to over 50 parties.
Well, the average number of parties contesting the Senate from 84, oh sorry, I keep doing that, from 84 to 2019 is about 28. But in 2013, 2016, 2019, especially 13 and 16, there were over 50 parties that nominated for the Senate. And in those days, of course, we had the group vote ticket, the GVT, so we could look at where these parties were sending their preferences, and on the basis of that we could say, right, oh, well, that's a right of centre operation and that's a left of centre, depending on whether they're preferencing the coalition or whether they're preferencing Labor. And the vast majority of these parties that are appearing were actually right of centre minor parties. Now, I know this has been a great controversy and it's come up at the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters and was the basis upon which the rules were changed and the GVT was abolished, and the allegation was that there was corruption at work. You know, there's someone there, people there coordinating, gaming the system. But there's another way of looking at party formation, and that's to say, well, it's a sign of something about the body politic. I go back to that point again, that there's a sense, I think, in these upper house contests that there's a much more polarised, rigid ideological battle going on there, which the voters are prepared to engage in. They're taking the opportunity that upper house voting gives voters. And I'm convinced that the Australian people know what they're doing in Senate elections, the way they voted for Pauline Hanson in 2004 and helped deliver the coalition its majority. It's a very sophisticated piece of electoral behaviour for a group of people that the commentariat like to disparage as moronic and
unsophisticated.
Unsophisticated, yeah.
Michael Danby, what do you think?
Well, I won't give you what I think. I'll ask a question because I think that's more polite. This is to Nick Economou. How much do you think it's a generational question in the inner city that younger people, particularly under 30, dislike both political parties so much? It's a kind of know-nothing vote. It was the political group in the 1840s in America who I think President Trump is the sort of successor to. But the know-nothing vote protests against both political parties. They're not interested in politics. They keep their head down when they come into the ballot box. They see the magical green triangle and vote for it as a protest against the parties. I agree with you about, so Tom, I will make a comment. I agree with him about the issue being more urgent in the upper house at the moment, but I can see the day when titans like Plibersek and Albanese retire, where there are smaller figures in the Labor Party who come in their place, and the Greens roll over those inner city seats, as they nearly have, they have in Melbourne since Lindsay Tanner left. Yeah. That will be a problem for the Australian body politic, in my opinion, because if they're the swing factor in the House of Representatives, it'll drive the whole political agenda of Australia much further to the left.
Zareh is actually better qualified than I to talk on these sorts of things because he's part of a research project that's looking at the young. There's all sorts of interest in the young, how they're responding to politics, what do they know about the system, etc. Now, I agree with your main proposition, as I understand it, that there's demographic change occurring, especially in the inner cities. We can see that through the census. One of the things that characterises inner city electorates is that they have a much lower median age than everywhere else. In fact, it's more fun to plot the distribution of the age distribution by quintiles, because that gives you an even greater sense of the demographic difference between the suburban seats, the rural and regional seats, and these inner urban seats really are dominated by people in the 25 to about 35 category. They also tend to be very well educated. They've got tertiary qualifications, and they are clearly the ones, the strongest Green voter in those electorates. So that, I do think there is something in that generational argument. I'm not sure about them being a know nothing about politics. I think that they think they're amazingly sophisticated. And one of the things that they have no time for are the intricacies or the complexities or the boring conservative nature of the Australian Constitution. And if I may, can I give you a little anecdote?
Quick one.
This is Chatham House, isn't it? Because I may reveal my source here, from the state election, Victorian state election, a couple of elections
It's
ago.
Chatham House, except for that camera.
Oh no, it's all right. I know someone who told me about a seminar that the successful Labor Party had after a state election. I'm sorry, I can't remember which one it was, I get the years confused, and candidates were asked to talk about what happened when they went door knocking. And my friend, who ran in an outer suburban seat, was asked, what did the voters in your electorate want to talk about? And he said, planning, urban planning. They were worried about all the Californian bungalows being knocked down and high density. They then asked the unsuccessful Labor candidate for Melbourne at the time, and this is a state election, what did everybody who you spoke to want to talk about? Refugees. Refugees. But this is a state election. I'm not interested in that. Politics is politics. So I think that it's not that they know nothing, I think that they know it all. And that they are taking, perhaps a know all rather than know nothing. I don't know, so what do you think?
We'll need to have one quick last question and comment and quick last reply.
Thank you. This is to my former constituent, Nick. Good to see you here, Nick. Back to the Democrats for a moment. The Democrats, of course, were involved in a very major reform of the Howard government, and some would say by being complicit, it was also the death of them. We also saw a couple of lower house MPs in the Gillard government be involved in some major reform as well, and they also went by the way. So is there a place for a minor party to be a negotiator of reform, or to be part of that, or should they remain with that ideological pursuit? Otherwise, they too may be tainted by one of the two parties.
Yeah. Look, presumably you're referring, Phil, to the GST negotiations, what have you. Remember that the Australian Democrats actually managed to win Senate representation in the election after the GST was brought in. So it wasn't a total disaster. I rather suspect that the beginning of the end for the Democrats had more to do with the internal fights in the aftermath of all of that. But I'm reminded a little bit of, now I can never remember his name, it was the replacement for the One Nation senator who was elected in Queensland in 1998, Len Harris. Len Harris. So Len Harris ended up being in the Senate. He was number 2 on the ticket. We all know the High Court disallowed Hill because she was not an Australian citizen. So there he was. Now there's a terrific book published by Stanley Bark, I think, called Platypus and Parliament, where he goes through, and I was reminded of Harris reading this book, where he talks about how for the Australian Democrats they helped revive the idea of the Senate as this place of negotiation and dialogue, etc., because the procedure of passing legislation puts you in that position. And Harris actually used to find himself on these committees or had been negotiating on stuff, so he was ending up being part of the very system that his party, which was an anti-system party, had been trying to critique in 98. So this brings us to the current situation. I rather suspect that the processes that are required, the parliamentary processes to make legislation, will force minor parties into that role, because eventually one or two parties of government are going to need to get the support of these parties to get their stuff through the parliament. But that still is, I think, not stopping them from coming across as very ideological, and there are other forums that the Senate provides that allows them to pursue these sorts of approaches. And so I think there might be a bit of a change going on in our perception of what the upper house is about. Not really about, well, I suppose procedurally it is about negotiation and dialogue, getting legislation through, but it's increasingly a platform for the ideologues to make their positions.
a fascinating discussion. It's a good way for us, I think, to segue into lunch, because there's much more, I think, that could be said, would be said and should be said about the matters that were raised. Would you please join with me in thanking Zareh and
Thank you.